I mean, every episode has been amongst some quote-unquote crisis.
Right.
But now we're at day 40-something of the government shutdown, the longest one in U.S. history, that they're estimating costs over $10 billion a week to the economy. But now, since it's November, the month of quote-unquote Thanksgiving, it's also the most difficult time for families receiving government benefits and SNAP.
Yeah, and, a lot of people have been, joking, even though it's sort of a sad LOL joke, is to go, oh, not in the year 2025. But truly, in the year 2025, a government shutdown is even worse than we felt it in the past couple of years. The economy's not at its greatest. People are suffering because things are expensive. And now we went from things are so expensive to people can't even eat. Right? That's what we're seeing right now is, and people talk about SNAP benefits this, SNAP benefits that. At the end of the day, it's not even just a benefit, it's just a right.
It's a human right.
It's a human right.
To access food.
Yeah.
And for your tax dollars to fund food instead of bombs.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I do harp a lot on the fact that I don't like that it's called SNAP benefits. And it's funny because it makes it seem very much like it's a handout when really it's supposed to be aid.
Right.
It's supposed to help people who don't have the means, and especially there's a lot more people who don't have the means to access a basic human right, which is food.
Exactly. So let's dive in. What is SNAP? The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That's almost 100 years old. It started during the New Deal in the 1930s during this Great Depression, where you see these pictures of soup kitchen lines where people literally had no jobs. The unemployment rate was almost half of people not working. And yet we had thousands of acres with farms, and the government could pay farmers to produce excess food that could then be distributed to millions of people in poverty.
Yeah.
We've been doing this for 100 years.
Right.
But now in November 2025, suddenly over 40 million Americans don't have access to their full SNAP benefits.
And I think what was especially painful was that the average person who was receiving, SNAP benefits didn't know that there was this government shutdown that was pending. You'd have to be sort of really paying attention, but there's so much to pay attention to that you may not have noticed it. But those in charge, those who are supposed to be in charge of their constituents, did see this coming. And so it was just such a slap in the face that, we supposedly, those in government are supposed to be the folks that represent the people, but they didn't give any heads up. And so for a lot of people, when the government shut down, SNAP benefits going away wasn't something they realized would happen, and it happened almost instantly.
Well, and that's the thing, Dee. It's like there actually are emergency funds to keep this going. And, at least politicians knew that and acknowledged it years ago that, well, if a government shutdown occurs, at the very least, people need to get their food, millions of people. So let's create this emergency fund to, if there's a political gridlock like this, the funds can still move forward. But the federal government has actually been blocking those funds and also stepping in when states try to feed their citizens where the federal government is failing, and telling the states that they can't do that. So it's like a really intentional effort by the federal government to ensure that people starve.
Right. And why, right? People are going to be like, well, why would the government do that? Because right now what we're seeing, which seems to be par for the course, is that those in Washington when I say those, I mean politicians, those in charge, seem to be a little bit more focused on fighting each other than protecting the people they're supposed to be caring for. And that's why it becomes an even bigger deal is, okay, fine, a government shutdown happens. It's sort of built into the system of how our government works in terms of trying to figure out budgets. Okay, the government acknowledged that, like you said, and said, here's an emergency fund. And it's even written when it was created that this emergency fund is so that there is no gap in services, there is no gap in resources for the people in this country.
Right.
But now, even though the intention is written right there that this is supposed to be used for emergencies, they're trying to say it's for natural emergencies, that it's for natural disasters, which I think is interesting because if you create the problem, and you also created the solution to the problem, failing to implement the solution in order to prolong suffering so that people end up sort of becoming this pawn in this political theater just kind of shows you that there's this huge disconnect between the people in this country and those running it. And that's just really, really disheartening. And even though people have probably figured this out already, it just feels like another blow and another reminder that there's this huge sort of disconnect.
Right. Yeah. So SNAP benefits, food access is literally being used as political leverage and causing millions of people to starve or be in lines for long. But let's start and talk about who's actually on SNAP, because we know there's this perception of who's on SNAP. But when you look at the numbers and even the history of who historically benefited the most. But whenever you say, you know, food stamps, EBT or different things, many people, because of media and programming, especially during the 80s and the 90s, this notion of a quote unquote welfare queen, of a woman with all of these children connecting SNAP benefits and EBT, living in a nice house, driving a Cadillac.
And it's not just any woman. The idea of the welfare queen and the way it was propagandized was definitely of a black woman, a brown woman, particularly a black woman, but a woman of color.
Mostly black women.
But it was basically not, you know, they're basically saying that, oh, people are taking advantage of, quote unquote, the system.
Right. There was a specific example. I think it was President Reagan or some conservative politician in the 80s. They had a specific example in Chicago that they used. And, you know, kind of sensitize this example to say this quote unquote welfare queen. But let's look at who's on SNAP right now. So it's over 42 million people nationwide on SNAP. And over 70% of these families actually have people working, most of them full time. I saw that actually Walmart is the biggest beneficiary of SNAP. Millions of its people.
I don't think people realize that what happens is people get their SNAP benefits and then they use them in these stores. So it's kind of interesting.
But not even just millions of SNAP dollars being spent in Walmart stores, but millions of Walmart employees actually needing SNAP because the corporate exploitation of their labor doesn't allow for them to afford food. So we're essentially subsidizing Walmart. And not just Walmart. I think Walmart is the largest recipient. Amazon is close, and then Dollar Tree and just other stores, retail chains that pay their employees, you know, less than $15 an hour, where they can't afford housing and food, so the federal government has to pay them.
And it's because those who are in charge and these corporations know that their employees can access these SNAP benefits, that they're intentionally taking that out of their budget for what the living wage is for their employees. So the Walmarts, the Walmart Corporation, all of these corporate entities, they are knowingly not paying their employees enough because they know, one, that they'll access SNAP benefits, and two, those SNAP benefits, those dollars are going to go back into their stores. So it's sort of like, if anyone is taking advantage of the welfare system, it's not the people who need it the most, it's the people who aren't paying them and require them to access those benefits.
And I don't even like the word welfare system anymore, because the United States is not a welfare state compared to other developed nations. If you look at how much money we actually spend on programs like SNAP and social programs, it's a fraction compared to what we spend on wars or tax cuts for the rich. And that's a big part of this stalemate as well, is, you know, there's almost $1 trillion in tax cuts for the rich. And how are you paying for them? Well, they're cutting food for the poor. And it's literally elderly and children who will be starved so that corporate CEOs can get tax cuts to buy bigger jets.
My family, my parents both worked. Growing up, we were on EBT. We had SNAP. Both my parents worked full-time jobs, right? My dad was a phone man. My mom at the time worked at a bank. She was a bank teller. These are jobs that, you know, if you're going to use the rhetoric, which I don't like, but if you're going to use the rhetoric, that's considered quote unquote professional. Those are quote unquote real jobs. Those are quote unquote like, you know, no one's looking at them and being like, oh, you should get a real job. Like, they both had full-time, quote-unquote, real jobs. They just also happened to have 2 kids and were immigrants and couldn't pay rent, couldn't pay everything, didn't get a living wage. And that's where these benefits came in for our family. But I'm pretty sure people weren't looking at us and being like, oh, I
welfare
bet you,
queen.
you know, like no one looked at my mom and was like, welfare queen, right? Because she didn't fit a certain stereotype. But also that's the thing is that there's this sort of terrible idea that if you are asking the government, whose job it is to take care of its people, for help, that you must be in dire straits.
Right.
When, you know, the average person just going to the grocery store right now knows that they've noticed that their grocery bill has gone up and I'm struggling to pay for groceries and I live by myself. I can't imagine having a whole family.
Yeah.
You know, and so we just, you know, the propaganda around the idea that asking the government for help when that's their whole job is to help people, it means that you are somehow unworthy is definitely a notion that needs to be thrown away. But that's the notion that people are playing off of.
And so many just typical regular Americans, like you said, need these services.
Yeah.
I mean, I also was on SNAP up until I was 18 with my family, but also actually after finishing law school, I had to get back on SNAP EBT while studying for the bar exam.
Yeah, you didn't have a job. You didn't
I
have
didn't
income.
have a job, and I couldn't work studying for the bar exam and doing other things.
Yeah.
Even though at that point I had 5 college degrees, right? But I was still this hyper educated person who needed this government assistance, but also as an adult who paid into this government assistance program as a taxpayer. And I think if you ask the average American if you would prefer for your money to go towards feeding children, elderly, and people who are unable to afford food versus tax cuts for the rich who don't need it, or bombs for Ukraine or other countries, I imagine they would want to say money for food.
Right. And again, we talked about it before, but it's not that there's no money.
Right.
It's that they don't want to spend the money on this issue. And that is really what is making people upset.
Right.
There is money. Don't get the notion that the United States, one of the most powerful and richest countries in the world, has no money to feed its people. They just decided that they'd rather not.
Right. And not only that, but SNAP actually helps the economy as well. Not just the wellness of people, but economic studies shown that every dollar in SNAP actually generates $1.50 in the economy, because that's paying farmers, that's paying retail, that's paying, for food and different things that people can't afford. So it actually helps to create this program. So it shows that we're kind of in this state of dysfunction and sabotage in the government, where not only do they want people to starve, but they want economic systems to crumble.
Right. And, this is happening in the midst of a government shutdown. And government shutdowns are not new. Right. We've seen government shutdowns in this country before.
I mean, our generation, in the past 10 years, we've seen the two largest in history.
Sure. But there's definitely something very different about this government shutdown. And while we are here to talk about, SNAP benefits and what's going on, let's just step back a little bit so we can figure out the context, right? This is happening because the government shut down. So there's a lot of things happening right now that people might not realize are connected. The flights that are getting delayed, the people being put on furlough and working without pay, including firefighters, people who can't get their SNAP benefits. All these things are connected and related to the government shutdown. And I guess the quick, why is there a government shutdown, is because right now the two parties in charge are sort of going back and forth over healthcare benefits. Unfortunately, a lot of things in our government are not set in stone. There's always an expiration date. And right now, what people are fighting over is the Affordable Care Act and what the premiums are going to look like.
What's often called Obamacare.
The Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act, also known as an attempt to assist people again, not quite SNAP benefits, but with healthcare instead, the healthcare version of SNAP benefits. But, people, the issue at hand is if the Affordable Care Act and all of its provisions as it stands now are to expire the way they're set to, premiums will jump so high that people might not be able to afford healthcare. And the whole point of the Affordable Care Act was that it be affordable.
Right.
And that's sort of the issue at hand. And so there's sort of a standoff going on right now because people don't want to concede. And for the people who go, can you really shut down the whole government over that? The answer is yes. Right. The government is meant to shut down whenever there's sort of this impasse between those in charge.
Right.
But again, what we said is the fail-safes were put in place but they're not being used.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the background of why we're seeing all these things happening all at once.
Yeah.
It can all be attributed to a government shutdown, which can all be attributed to political theater.
Right.
But what makes this very different is it seems like there's more of an ideological conflict than in the past. In the past, it felt like people were just like fighting over a number.
Yeah.
Now people are really just sort of, it's a big ideological fight.
Folks are in their feelings. It kind of looks like you're on the playground watching two children fight while the playground is burning down and people are crying and starving when there are literally real issues happening. But because of this, the country's at a stalemate and it's harming things. And yet, I mean, I just heard yesterday, I think the 90th person was killed in a bomb from the government, and as they've been doing in the Caribbean and in the Pacific.
Right.
So the government is still open. The federal government is still finding time for bombs and money for bombs and different things. Yet when it comes to finding a way to feed our children and elders, they're not able to do that.
Right. And I think in the past, I say past, I mean recent history, because a lot of people might not have a full understanding of how a government shutdown has hurt them before, because we've not seen it be such a direct hit. Government shutdowns have always affected people, but usually it affects federal employees, right? They're not getting paid, they're working for free, and they're just waiting for back pay once the government opens again. But affecting SNAP benefits, affecting flights, affecting all these things feel very direct. And again, it feels like this was not necessarily you could prevent the shutdown, but it feels like there could have been ways to make sure that people in this country weren't affected so drastically.
Right. I mean, the United Nations and different international bodies define access to food or preventing access to food as a crime against humanity.
Right.
And this government has a deep history of preventing food access for certain groups. I mean, going back to enslaved Africans who literally couldn't forage or take fruit off a tree unless it was a specific area. They couldn't hunt even after slavery ended and couldn't grow in certain areas. So literally couldn't access food because of laws and restrictions. And you see tones of that today where access to food is being used, access to food and just this basic necessity of nutrition is being used to prevent people from being able to experience life. And then that gets into healthcare and other things. So it's literally starving and killing the own people from the government. This is why the Black Panther Party in the 1960s was literally declared public enemy number one because of a free breakfast program. Right. Because they noticed giving children access to breakfast in the morning actually improved their test scores and did other things. And that's when the federal government decided to adopt, a program that provided free breakfast. But it's always been communities stepping up, whether it's mutual aid. Fannie Lou Hamer also during the civil rights movement created these Freedom Farm collectives where it was just land and people were starving and the government wasn't meeting the need. So they used the land and the labor and provided free food to people throughout the South. So the government declared that program to be a problem as well, and Fannie Lou Hamer to be an issue. And you see the failure of the government now to just provide basic nutrition to its own citizens.
Right. It's a rich history that's something to be proud of, but it's just really sad that it came up. But we do have a history of people stepping up in their communities where the government falls short, right? We see that, well, if we can't rely on the government or these programs, then we'll create our own. And I think it's interesting that it's been deemed a threat. And I think the only reason it's deemed a threat is because the government starts to realize, like, oh, shoot, that's our job. And like, oh, that could have been, they try to turn it into a moneymaker. But at the end of the day, with everything that's going on, it sounds so heavy and it's access to food. It is nice to see that communities are stepping up, right? We're seeing mutual aid. People understand what mutual aid is. People are just feeding their neighbors at this point.
Right. Restaurants are opening up and feeding their
in my neighborhood, folks are, restaurants in my neighborhood are getting together and be like, hey, if you didn't get your SNAP benefits or you can't afford anything, like, let us know. We'll figure it out.
Despite the federal government's attempt to starve millions of people, different states and different organizations, different community groups have been stepping up. Right. And actually, we have a resource at knowyourrightscamp.org/food resources where you can search food pantries and food banks all over the nation. You can type in a city, you can search by state and see that there are still organizations, faith-based organizations, community organizations that are stepping up to feed people.
Yeah, and it's, it's sort of the pattern we've been seeing a lot recently, which is people stepping up when the government doesn't. And it's unfortunate that that's the reason for it, but it is really, it gives a lot of hope to see that people still care for each other, that people are stepping up for each other. And it can be as basic as, grabbing groceries for your neighbor. It can be communities deciding that, restaurants are going to get together and help feed people. And it could be, like you said, mutual aid groups doing what they need to do. And not only are, communities having to step up like this just because there's so much going on, but they're stepping up because even the states are being stopped from helping supplement SNAP benefits. So what's happening in some states is that, hey, for example, in California, they're saying, hey, we have emergency funds. What we're going to do is figure out who in our state was receiving SNAP benefits, and we're going to fund you. But then the federal government came and said, no, you can't do that either. So if there was any doubt, again, about what's happening here, it's that the federal government is really trying to prevent aid from going to people in the name of this ideological battle.
And you see states resisting. I mean, Wisconsin and Oregon were other states that also said we will fully fund. But over half of states actually sued the federal government. The attorney generals and others, they sued the federal government for this right, for this access to it. So you're seeing this fight between the state and federal government over the food.
Right. And I want to get back to how community groups are helping, but it's important to point out that the federal government actively going against states doing what they want to do for their people is very unlike what the current administration has been touting as one of their biggest ideals, which is no big government.
Right. Not just the current administration, the entire Republican Party says, local control, no big government.
Yeah, no big government, local control, states' rights, right? We're hearing and seeing that a lot. But what's interesting is that we've talked about other issues on this podcast. We've talked about, immigration rights, et cetera, et cetera. Those, the federal government said, no, we're not going to allow it to be a state-by-state issue. This is going to be a federal issue.
Right.
So even here where states said, we're going to pick up the slack, the federal government is saying no. And so people need to start paying attention to what's being said versus what's being done. And what we're seeing is there's a lot of big government, actually. And so if people are really going to stick to their guns about what they believe in, there should be a lot more opposition to the way the current administration is handling not just this issue, but a lot of other issues.
I think there's potentially a claim for a crime against humanity with the federal government stepping in to ensure that states have to starve their citizens. Because, the state of Michigan went down to 50% with partial benefits. Virginia went down, or Texas went down to 65% because of this, and just others. So they're literally giving away less food because the federal government is forcing them to do so. And that's a crime against humanity.
And it's interesting because let's put some numbers to it. I don't think people realize that when people are receiving SNAP benefits, that they're not receiving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars, right? Let's further debunk that sort of welfare queen.
I think the max is like 400 something if you have a large family.
For a family. And I think they're saying that the average, and I think most users, their families, is like 187 or something like that dollars per month.
Right.
I want people to stop and think about their own grocery bills.
That's like a week's worth of groceries for me.
Think about like your own grocery bills as an individual. Think about what it would be for a family of 4. And let's include and imagine what it's like for folks who don't have a lot of money. Take that minute, do the math in your head, and you realize that we're fighting over not a lot of money per person.
At all.
We're asking $187 doesn't even ensure, and nutritious food per month.
Right.
The good food is expensive. The healthy food is expensive. We're not even asking the government to fund people healthily. We're asking for benefits to just feed people at all.
Right. And this is still less than 1% of what our government actually spends. And if you look at what other nations do comparatively, they spend significantly more, and they wouldn't use it as a political bargaining chip to get what they want.
Yeah.
And this issue isn't new in terms of the moral bankruptcy of this country and the inability of it to do the right thing for people. And I want to go to a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King where he kind of talked about this. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit. So Dr. Martin Luther King says, and I paraphrase this, A nation that spends more on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching a spiritual death. And that's what this country is doing, because literally, as we're not allowing funds to go pay for baby formula, for elders to get their vitamins and different things, we're literally still sending billions abroad and bombing countries in extrajudicial killings.
Again, access to food should never be an issue, especially if you're supposedly one of the most wealthy and powerful nations in the world.
Right.
It should be a very basic human right, and it should be treated as so. And so the takeaway is that it's not being treated as a basic human right.
Right. Let's talk about how access to food, paying for food in the first place is a scam. It's free. It grows everywhere. There's so much abundance. We literally throw away food. And this is really a modern thing to just have to pay for everything. Before, we just had systems of codependency where we shared, and literally seeds just go into the ground and grow with rain, like apple trees, orange orchids, and different things. Avocado trees naturally exist, and people should have access to it.
Right. But again, you know, food has become weaponized. Food has become a political thing, and I get it. Everyone's existence is political, but everyone thriving should not be.
Right.
Yeah.
So as of now, where we are on the 40-plus day of this government shutdown, one of the houses has moved forward with a compromise vote from, 7 Democrats and an independent have caved to the Republicans' demands, and it could move to the Senate in a few days and move forward, and there be some reopening. But it might look like literally the reasons why they were holding out might not actually happen.
Right. It seems like right now there's been such an uproar over the shutdown that the government is sort of just moving to reopen. But what happens when they reopen, I guess, remains to be seen. We don't know what's going to happen with, you know, the issue at hand, which is medical premiums. But for now, the best we can do is just pay attention.
Right. There's a pinky promise to maybe revisit that conversation.
Sure. A pinky promise. Great. I guess the best we could do is remind folks to pay attention and to keep looking out for each other, because while we may not know what the government does and we may not know where the funds go, at least the consistency is that community is always there.
Right. And take this frustration to the ballot box, as some folks did earlier in November this month, where we did see some victories in cities like New York, where you have basically Democratic Socialist candidates who would feed people being elected.
Right.
So,
you know, there's hope somewhere, even if we just have to look a little harder for it.
Right.
For more information and for a list of food resources, please visit us at knowyourrightscamp.org/food resources.